You've heard about when the bottom line is? Well, today's talk is when the bottom line isn't. Whenever someone turns up the heat on Hollywood for terrorism on television, the media moguls have several stock replies to the charges. Let's look at those standard answers. Art imitates life, says Hollywood. We're just telling it like it is. But the camera chooses what aspects of life it will focus on. And the focus is usually not on the normal and wholesome, but on the sordid and vile, resulting in a gross distortion of reality that tends to corrupt. When The Godfather first came out, says actor Joe Mantegna, gangland killings went up 10%. These guys were imitating art more than art was imitating them. Telling it like it is? Not true. Television, you see, gives us not reality, but a sick distortion of it. Crime is portrayed on television about 55 times more often than it occurs in real life, while the specific crime of murder is portrayed at nearly 1,000 times its real-world rate. On television, illicit sex virtually never has consequences such as venereal disease, AIDS, or pregnancy. On television, almost no one attends church. Yet, according to a January issue of Newsweek, 40% of Americans attend worship services weekly, 5 times as many as go to the movies in a given week. Or how about this? In real life, 90% of Americans identify themselves with Christianity. On the screen, there's almost no continuing series placed in a modern-day setting with a single person who is identified as a Christian. Most film characters identified as Christians are crazies. Likewise, most businessmen are portrayed as criminals. In real life, smoking has dropped dramatically, but not on the screen. Back in the 1980s, on the screen, 57% of major characters in a high socioeconomic status were smokers. In real life, the figure is only 19%. Thanks, Hollywood, for helping to promote an industry that kills well over 1,000 people a day in this country alone. Oh, here's another Hollywoodism. Well, if you don't like it, just turn it off. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. A few years ago, a mother and her young daughter were watching the movie Born Innocent. When a scene came on in which a young girl was brutally raped with the handle of a plunger, the mother turned off the set. A few days later, her little daughter was raped with a beer bottle by a group of boys who had seen the incident on the tube and had not turned it off. Turning off the set didn't help this innocent victim. Dealing with the problem of television violence by saying, well, if you don't like it, just turn it off, is like dealing with the problem of drugs by saying, if you don't like it, just don't buy it. Another of Hollywood's standard replies whenever they are criticized for the evil they portray goes something like this: we're just giving the people what they want. Our products simply reflect the tastes of the average American. Of course, it can be argued that corporations should exercise their freedom responsibly and maintain certain standards in their dealings with the public. And drug dealers also give their customers what they want. But we do not accept that as a justification for their behavior. However, leave that aside. Let's find out if it is indeed true that Hollywood is simply reflecting the tastes of the American average person. Does the movie industry simply operate on the motive of maximizing profits? Now, the amazing answer is, as film critic Michael Medved has so clearly pointed out in his book, Hollywood versus America, the answer is no. The astounding truth is that Hollywood has a preference for the perverse, in spite of the fact that perversion is a money-losing proposition. Did you hear what I said? Hollywood is not merely selling a product for profit. It is peddling a philosophy of life, an ideology of evil, and it is willing to lose millions in the process. I know this seems hard to believe. So let's look at the facts. Up until 1967, the church and Hollywood had a good working relationship. The studios adhered to a moral code that was informed by religious leaders. But in 1967, Hollywood abandoned the paralyzing restrictions of that old production code. In that year, American movies drew an average weekly audience, says Medved, of only 17.8 million, compared to the weekly average of 38 million who had gone to the theaters just 1 year before. In a single 12-month period, more than half of the movie audience disappeared, by far the largest one-year decline in the history of the motion picture business. It seems that Americans didn't like the new sludge. Now, this reading of the situation is confirmed by an analysis of how much money various types of movies make. Before Medved's book, it was commonly assumed movies that were heavy on sex and violence made more money than standard family fare. Surprise, not so. According to Medved, an analysis of all 1,010 domestic releases logged into the comprehensive database at Robert Kane Consulting Associates between 1983 and 1989 demonstrates a dramatic and unmistakable public preference for family-oriented material. During this period, all G films achieved a median box office gross of $17.3 million, while PG titles earned a median figure of $13.0 million. For PG-13 releases, the numbers dipped sharply to $9.3 million, while R-rated pictures returned an even more pathetic median gross of $8.3 million. Now, in response to this consistent trend throughout the decade, one might reasonably expect that Hollywood would adjust its approach and reduce the levels of sex and violence and gutter language so that fewer films would earn the R rating. Instead, official figures from the Motion Picture Association of America show that the percentage of R-rated movies dramatically increased from 46% in 1980 to 67% in 1989. Are you getting this? Although Hollywood is making less and less money on the trash it produces more and more trash. Are studio executives incompetent? No. It's just that there is one thing that is more important to them than money: converting the American public to their way of thinking. Now, to show the pattern, let's compare the fates of two films. Martin Scorsese's film, The Last Temptation of Christ, aroused the fury of evangelical Christians. Full of sex, violence, twisted history, and blasphemy, it received the most lavish pre-release publicity in modern motion picture history and opened to rave results and reviews by the critics. Yet with all this publicity, it lost somewhere around $10 million. Contrast this with the 1990 film China Cry, funded by Trinity Broadcasting Network, a heart-rending true story of a young mother who undergoes a religious conversion while suffering brutal persecution at the hands of the Chinese communists. With no well-known stars and virtually no promotion budget, China Cry drew larger audiences per showing than major releases such as Rocky V or Goodfellas or Predator 2 that were showing alongside it in multiplex theaters. It earned the same amount of money that The Last Temptation of Christ lost, $10 million. China Cry was co-produced by Tim Penland, a respected Hollywood insider who resigned his position as a consultant at Universal over the movie The Last Temptation of Christ. You know, we see the same pattern in television serials. The Cosby Show, for decades before the sex scandal, was back then an oasis in a desert wasteland. This television family actually attended church. I remember one of their programs that featured Felicia Rashad taking part in a religious service and singing an inspirational choir solo. The popularity back then of The Cosby Show demonstrated the mass appeal of conservative programs. For several years, it pulled more viewers than any series in TV history. Unfortunately, of course, it too now is gone with the demise of Bill Cosby. But listen, over the course of the last 25 years or so, the major studios have slid into insolvency. In 1984, the three major networks made a cumulative profit of $800 million. By 1988, it was down to $400 million. Today is less than zero. The ledger sheets tell us that Hollywood has lost touch with the ideals of America and that Americans are sick of the stench emanating from the studios. Now, friend, the solution is not government censorship, but economic penalties. Although money may not be the ultimate incentive in Hollywood, it is still very important. The best way to get rid of this cancer, says Ann Landers, is to boycott the sponsors. Write to the networks that show the bone-chilling stuff and tell them you will not tune into their stations as long as they continue to show such films. Then, take note of the sponsors. Write to them and say you will not buy their products, and make good your threat. So, where does the Bible-believing Christian go with all this glitter of Tinseltown? Will Hollywood see the light and have a change of heart? I'm not betting on it. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe. If enough people speak out, we can make a difference.